It is decision time. As much of America takes a break and celebrates Thanksgiving, President Trump and the impeachment committees have some major decisions to make over the coming days. White House officials will spend their Thanksgiving weekend up against a Sunday deadline to decide whether to participate in an impeachment hearing next week that is to be led by the House Judiciary Committee. In a letter to Trump, Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler gave the White House a deadline of 6 p.m. this Sunday to let them know whether Trump or a lawyer representing him plans to appear at the hearing, which is scheduled for December 4th. That is next week. Politico reports that the president's involvement seems unlikely at this point. Quote, as of right now, people close to President Donald Trump on the White House staff and on Capitol Hill do not believe he will send a lawyer to participate in next week's judiciary impeachment hearings, as is his right. But nailing down this White House is like trying to tack Jell-O to a wall. They are ever shifting, and they hardly stay on the same page on trivial matters, let alone decisions of the utmost import. Trump and his Republican allies have long argued that the impeachment process is not fair, in part because of claims that they would have without legal representation, that Trump would not get due process. And it's not just the president with a big decision to make. Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee are deciding how to present the evidence in their committee report that is expected to make the case for impeaching President Trump. Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff's staff is now working to compile the evidence, which will then be transmitted to the House Judiciary Committee shortly after lawmakers return from their holiday break. This, according to the New York Times. And that leads us to the biggest decision of all. The Judiciary Committee is starting to decide whether to move forward with formal articles of impeachment against Trump, and if so, what those articles would exactly be. Now, our next guest has some thoughts on what those articles could look like. In his new book, Impeach: The Case Against Donald Trump, former acting Solicitor General and MSNBC contributor Neil Katyal lays out what he believes are three high crimes that he says the president is, quote, clearly guilty of. They are this: number one, abusing the public trust by soliciting foreign interference in the 2020 presidential election. Number two, abusing the public trust by engaging in bribery repeatedly through his quid pro quo exchanges with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Number three, abusing the public trust by obstruction of justice in the investigations of his conduct, adopting an unconstitutional view of executive power. Joining us now is Neil Katyal, whose new book, Impeach: The Case Against Donald Trump, came out just this week. Neil, thank you for joining us. Appreciate you being here. I want to get into the arguments you're making in this book, but first I want to talk basic strategy with you because we laid out some major decisions on both sides that need to be settled in the days ahead. One that Democrats appear to be making right now. This is from the New York Times on Democrats deciding to move forward quickly with the next steps. Here from the Times, the decision to press ahead quickly means that Democrats are making a calculated decision to forego opportunities to obtain more testimony and records that are relevant to their inquiry, a risk that was underscored hours after they announced their plans. The decision, in other words, Neil, not to wait for weeks, maybe months here for courts to compel whether it's material or witness appearances, and to go forward strategically. Do you think that is a smart move for Democrats to make here?
100%. I think it's the right move, Steve. And, you know, this is a big argument in my book, which is the book really tries to set out the clear, simple case for what Trump did and why it is kind of the height of an impeachable offense. And that evidence is all there. And it starts with that transcript of the president's phone call with the president of Ukraine on July 25th. Now, sure, would we like to have the testimony of Ambassador Bolton and a whole bunch of other people? Yeah, but all of that is gravy as we think about tomorrow. It's all stuff you don't actually need to make the case. It's helpful, but, you know, you don't need it. So that's point one. And point two is this White House is engaged in unprecedented obstruction. I mean, in many ways, even worse than President Nixon during Watergate. And so, you know, they've gagged every single executive branch employee from going and testifying. And so I think the Democrats' calculation is, look, we can go to the courts. We're going to win in the courts, but it's going to take us some time to do that. And so instead, let's just go full steam ahead with the evidence we got, which is frankly overwhelming. And we know this really because the White House is now really given up on most of a factual defense of the president's conduct. They and their allies are not really saying Trump did things right. They're rather just attacking the integrity of the process and saying it's unfair and this and that. But they're attacking the process. They're not defending the president.
Let's look at the arguments you're making here. We put up the 3 counts that you say could constitute impeachment articles against the president. I noticed you use the word bribery there, and there's been a lot of discussion recently about the use of that word. There's been some reporting that perhaps Democrats decided strategically, after perhaps polling, focus groups, that sort of thing, to latch onto the word because they believed it was effective. I've also heard the argument that using bribery could be important because when you look at the Constitution for the definition of impeachment, you get treason, bribery, and then high crimes. And high crimes is sort of ill-defined. It's sort of open to interpretation. Is it important for Democrats to make the case that one of those 2 words, treason or bribery, applies here?
It's very helpful. And, I don't know anything about the polls you're referring to and all of that. But in the book, I lay out, and I've written this kind of like a Dan Brown, lay out the history in a kind of page-turning way. And that history with respect to bribery is really interesting. And what the framers were trying to do in Philadelphia in 1787 was enumerate a couple of examples of what a high crime and misdemeanor would be. And bribery is a really good one because it's really the height of a president putting his personal interest above those of the American people. And that is exactly what happened with this Ukraine thing. The president went and sought dirt from a foreign government on his political enemy and held up aid and did all sorts of stuff in the process. And that's really, I think that really, if you think about what were the founders thinking of in 1787, this is what they were thinking of, Steve.
When you take a look at the polling on this, obviously, we just had several weeks of the hearings there, nationally televised hearings. There was a lot of talk. Would this move the needle decisively one way or the other? There was a CNN poll this week that showed support for impeaching and removing Trump. The exact same number, in fact, before the hearings, after the hearings. There are some other polls out where the margin is a little closer there. When you look at the totality, Neil, of the polling that's out there, what I keep thinking is impeach and remove and don't impeach, don't remove. It looks like Clinton versus Trump. It looks like the results of the 2016 presidential election. It looks like that same basic divide that was there in 2016 has carried over to this dispute over the president and impeachment. It leads to the question that's out there that critics are raising that are saying it's an election year in 2020. Trump is set to face the voters. Why not make the case that he's unfit for office because of this to the voters and have them render that verdict as opposed to having Congress preemptively do it through impeachment?
So 2 things, Steve. First of all, I really think this is just parroting the White House's talking points when people talk about the polls and this and that. We're talking about the most solemn thing imaginable, which is, has the president abused his oath of office and abused the power that he's been given as commander-in-chief? And regardless of what the polls say, I think that question has to be investigated, asked, and ultimately ruled on both by the House and the Senate. And it's so early in this process right now to say, oh, the polls are saying one thing, therefore we know the outcome is foreordained. I mean, we don't know that. And that's why we have a legal process. That's why our founders put impeachment in the Constitution. And that brings me to the second point, which is, in 1787, Stephen, they were talking about exactly this. Founders like Elbridge Gerry said, we don't need to have impeachment in the Constitution because presidents will run for re-election. And then other founders like Madison said, oh, wait a minute. What if you have a president who cheats on his reelection campaign? What if you have someone who is beholden to a foreign government and gets power from them? And then even Gerry changes his mind and says, yes, we have to put impeachment in the Constitution. And here, make no mistake about it, the allegation against the president is he sought to cheat in the 2020 election. I don't think you reward that by saying, oh, let's go and have the 2020 election. That's like if you and I were, playing a game of Monopoly and, I was accused of cheating. I don't think it'd be a very powerful answer to say, oh, well, let's resolve this dispute over whether I cheated by playing another game of Monopoly. No, you go and you investigate the facts and you figure out what happened, particularly when we're talking about something as solemn as this. We're talking about the nation's most powerful official. And these allegations, which, the whistleblower report has been corroborated day after day after day, testimony after testimony. The president has tried to gag this testimony, but some of it still come out. And all of it suggests that the president did something that is really an offense against the American people. He held up taxpayer aid, taxpayer-produced aid, congressionally appropriated aid in order to advance his private election interests. If that's not impeachable, I don't know what is. We're going to read the impeachment clause out of the Constitution if the president, gets away with it.
Well, that leads me to my next question to you then, and that is sort of you're making the case on principle that this is something that should be done. But of course, major actions that Congress takes, major events in Washington end up creating precedents one way or the other. So if on principle, Congress, the House of Representatives, goes ahead and impeaches the president for the reasons you're saying, and then the Senate acquits him, does not convict him, does not remove him from office, what is the precedent that would then be set? How would the country be different as a result of that?
I think it'd be a bad precedent, but boy, it'd be a worse precedent if we said, oh, we're worried about President Trump's support in the poll numbers 1 week or a week and a half after impeachment hearings have begun, so let's just stop them in the first place. I think we have a duty to investigate, and every member in the House of Representatives and ultimately every member in the Senate is going to have to look at themselves in the mirror and say, am I actually doing what I came to Washington to do? And I think when you think about it that way, the way I put it in the book is, just imagine that this were President Obama who was alleged to have done all of this stuff. Would you feel the same way about impeachment? I do think the Democrats would be seeking his impeachment and voting for it. And I certainly know the Republicans would be. That's the whole idea of what justice is. It's literally a statue of a blindfolded lady, because the idea is it doesn't matter who's before you, rich or poor, Republican or Democrat, man or woman, you do the same thing. And here, if we allow this president to say, oh, it's okay, you can cheat or attempt to cheat in an election, in a re-election, we're saying that for every president from now until eternity, Republican and Democrat and independent alike. And that is the essence of the destruction of our democratic system if we let this conduct go unpunished.
All right, Neal Katyal, your new book is called Impeach, the Case Against Donald Trump. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.